Good evening. How's everybody doing? That's Shlomo Katz singing his song Hashata Hacha. And we're working our way through his album Likrat Shabbat. How's everybody doing? It's good to be with you. Let's light up the darkness. Who's with us on a Wednesday night? We can be saying good Shabbos already for sure. You can always say good Shabbos, but especially from Wednesday on. Nancy in North Carolina, Melissa in Great Neck, Yehud in South Carolina, Harold in Portland, James in Indianapolis, Paul in the Great Northwest, Paula says shalom all, Bella in Florida, Shandora in the Bronx, John in Maine, Rick in the Chicago area, Rebecca in LA, the other Paula in Chicago, Sharon in New Jersey, and David in South Bend, Indiana. Over on YouTube, Aoife from Florida. Welcome everybody. Tonight's episode of AT Daily is sponsored by Dr. Spencer and Nancy Ehrman in memory of Seneca Ehrman, MD, Shalom Lazar Ben Harav Getzel Esther. I'm guessing, Spencer, that's your dad. So may his memory always be for a blessing, and may our learning today accrue to his merit and lift him up even a little bit higher in the world of souls. We say amen. And thank you, Spencer and Nancy, for enabling us to share more Torah with more people around the world. May you and all your loved ones be showered in blessings. And we say amen. All right, we are on page 15 here in Tractate Yevamos. And yesterday we were looking at this fascinating issue we're now in the second Mishna and working our way through the Gemara commentary on the second Mishna of chapter 1. And we learned that whereas Mishnah number 1, just spelled out, these are the women with prohibited relationships to their brother-in-law, in addition to being their brother-in-law, that he's their brother-in-law. That because they have some other familial relationship, they cannot perform yibum, levirate marriage, and therefore they're exempt from chalitza also, and their co-wives. So the brother who died without having children had 2 wives. One is exempt from yibum because of this other relationship with the surviving brother. Then the co-wife, who doesn't have such a relationship, is exempt as well. In Mishnah number 2, we're talking about wives who have an even stronger relationship that's so strong that the yibum is just completely out of the question, but the co-wives would be permitted, even according to Beis Hillel. But now we go back and say, well, actually in Mishnah number 1, Beis Hillel would exempt those co-wives, just like the wife, the Yevama, the widow of the brother who died without children. She is prohibited from entering into yibum, and therefore chalitza doesn't apply with the yavam, the surviving brother, the brother-in-law. And likewise, the co-wife would be exempted. But according to Beis Shammai, the followers of Shammai, the other school of thought, the other major school of thought in Second Temple times, Beis Shammai say, well, the Yevama in question, who has this other familial relationship with the brother-in-law, she's exempt, but the co-wife is not. Therefore, if the co-wife is not exempted by the Yevama with the familial relationship, so then, whereas according to Beis Hillel, she's just free and she can go marry whoever she wants. She certainly cannot perform yibum. with the brother-in-law, with the Yavam, and if she performs chalitza with him, it's a meaningless ritual. She wasn't obligated to in Yibum, so the chalitza isn't really a mitzvah. It's just, a ritual that would have no meaning since Yibum doesn't apply. But according to Beis Shammai, the co-wife is not exempted. Therefore, she is obligated in Yibum. And if she would prefer, she and the brother-in-law would prefer not to marry each other, to have a child in the name of the brother who died without children, then they perform chalitza. So according to Beis Shammai, one who follows the opinion of Beis Hillel, and that this co-wife was just exempt, so she would go off and marry someone else following the teaching of Beis Hillel. But in the eyes of Beis Shammai, since she did not perform chalitza with the brother-in-law before going to marry someone else, she violated a prohibition. Now that's a regular prohibition. It bears neither a death penalty nor charis, death at the hands of the heavenly court. But she did violate a prohibition. And the result of that is that the children of such a union, they're not mamzers, but they would have a flawed lineage such that if this was a Cohen family, a priestly family, the child of such a union, even though his father is a priest, he would be disqualified from serving in the temple because his mother did not perform a required chalitza with her brother-in-law before going off and marrying this other guy who happens to be a priest. Now, according to Beis Hillel, these co-wives are exempt. So if such a co-wife who's exempt and thus prohibited in Yibum, if she followed the ruling of Beis Shammai and she actually did perform Yibum with her brother-in-law, so then she now violated a prohibition that has a charis penalty, death at the hands of the heavenly court. According to some opinions, the children of such a marriage would be a mamzer. Right, so it prohibited from marrying anyone else among the Jewish people except another mamzer. Very serious consequences. And that's why this division between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai on this subject was very important, right? We're not just talking about theoretical, hypothetical concepts that only have meaning in the study hall. According to how which school of thought you subscribe to, Beis Hillel or Beis Shammai, could have very serious ramifications for the family life and the community of families who are impacted by this. So one solution that the sages have put forward is that, well, Beis Shammai held that way, but they didn't follow their own ruling in the interests of peace and to follow this commandment that we saw, I guess, 2 days ago or maybe yesterday, you shall not cut, right? It says in the Torah, you shall not cut, meaning you shall not cut yourselves over the dead. But because the grammar of that verse has a kind of repetition of you shall not cut yourselves, the sages also learn out from it, you shall not factionalize the Jewish people. You won't have rulings among the Jewish people that would preclude, segments of the Jewish people from marrying other segments of the Jewish people or from being at peace with other segments of the Jewish people. You might have different customs in different communities, but that doesn't lead to factions arising that would really cleave the Jewish people in two. But this kind of a ruling could have that kind of impact. And so they said, okay, well, so Beis Shammai, one solution is Beis Shammai held, differently than Beis Hillel on whether these co-wives are obligated in Yibum or not. But in practice, they would follow the ruling of Beis Hillel, since that was the majority ruling. And after the divine voice came from heaven and said that the law follows Beis Hillel, it was just the normative law to follow Beis Hillel. And so Beis Shammai must have followed Beis Hillel. But what about before that Bas Kol came? And what about the fact that Beis Shammai were generally sharper than Beis Hillel? And now we have a bunch of opinions that Beis Shammai did follow their own opinions. They held to their principle and acted on it. So then what would happen if, a child of a union that according to Beis Hillel is a mamzer, but according to Beis Shammai is, a legitimate child, or a child that according to Beis Shammai is disqualified for the priesthood, but according to Beis Hillel, no. right? What about those kinds of factions happening? And so the alternative solution was Beis Shammai did follow their rulings. They did act according to their rulings. But when it came time to intermarry, and we learned in our Mishna that Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel did intermarry. There was they did not split the Jewish people. And the children of families that followed Beis Shammai did marry the children of families that followed Beis Hillel. And how would they do that? Since they had these different outcomes according to their legal rulings, is that in such a case where this would come up and cause a problem, they would say, we followed Beis Shammai in our ruling when this co-wife came up for Yibum with her brother-in-law, and she performed Yibum, and this is a child of that union. According to Beis Hillel, that would be a mamzer, so since you're a Beis Hillel family, don't marry this child. They notified the other side of what had been done, and so everybody was comfortable that they had the information they needed. That these cases are still very rare in any case, but when it would come up and it would have that kind of an impact, everybody had full notice, and then they could act accordingly. All right, that's where we are now. And at the end of yesterday, we were sort of talking about, what kinds of cases came up between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai, not only regarding marriage, they had different rulings, but also whether a particular utensil had been rendered ritually impure or not, and yet they would still borrow vessels from each other, because they would notify if there was a ruling that would have, one of these kinds of impacts different on your community than on mine. There's also cases of certainty versus uncertainty. And the Gemara asks, in what way are uncertain cases different from certain cases, such as forbidden rival wives? If you say that certain cases are undoubtedly prohibited in the opinion of Beis Hillel, then the cases involving uncertain circumstances, for example, one who divorced his wife and then stayed with her in the same inn. We don't know if after they were divorced, they slept together and she became pregnant again from him, whether they violated a law or not, because this question of people who got divorced and then they traveled together and had a room together even though they were divorced, according to one view, well, then we just assume that they got married again. If they slept together after getting divorced and they hadn't been with other people in the meantime, their sleeping together constitutes getting remarried. Whereas on the other opinion, they could share a room and be trusted not to do that. So we don't assume that they have remarried. But it's a case of uncertainty because we don't know what happened in that room. So even if Beis Hillel rendered these cases prohibited only due to the uncertainty involved, the ruling would come out the same. The Gemara answers, do not say in the uncertain cases, i.e. the law involved doubtful circumstances. Rather, say from the unspecified case. In other words, barring clear knowledge of an uncertain betrothal within a specific family, they would take women from that family in marriage. A Beis Hillel family would marry into a Beis Shammai family. And the reason is that Beis Shammai would notify Beis Hillel of the prohibition according to their opinion, and they would refrain from Beis Hillel would have the opportunity to refrain from that marriage. They had full notice. If there was no notification, this was a clear sign that no doubt was involved in this case at all, right? Beis Shammai would notify Beis Hillel not only if for sure there was a problem according to the law as Beis Hillel saw it, but even if there was a possibility of such a problem. And the Gemara asks, but if so, what does this come to teach us? Is it that they had relations of affection and camaraderie between them, between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai, i.e. that each trusted that the other side would never cause them to err with regard to something they held to be prohibited? Well, this is the same as the first clause of the Baraisa. What is Rabbi Shimon adding by his statement? And the Gemara answers, this comes to teach us that the entire Baraisa that we've been discussing is the opinion of Rabbi Shimon. This is not a dispute between two sages. Rather, Rabbi Shimon's opinion elucidates the earlier statement. Now the Gemara offers an alternative resolution to this situation. Come in here, Tashema. As Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri said, how should one act with regard to this law of the co-wives, right? Beis Hillel, if a wife is exempt from Yibum and Halitza, her co-wife is also. But according to Beis Shammai, if a wife is exempt from Yibum and Chalitza, her co-wife is not exempt, and she should perform Yibum with the Yavam, the brother-in-law, or Chalitza, one or the other. The co-wife is obligated, even though the first wife is her co-wife is not. So according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, how should one act with regard to the law of rival wives? In what form should it become widespread among the Jewish people? Well, if we act in accordance with the statement of Beis Shammai, and we permit a co-wife in Yibum, well then the offspring, the children of such a union, where Beis Hillel said she was prohibited from marrying her brother-in-law, therefore the children of such a union will be mamzer, the child of such a union will be a mamzer, according to the statement of Beis Hillel. If we act in accordance with the statement of Beis Hillel, and we grant full exemption to the co-wives, well then, then those wives, instead of performing Yibum or Chalitza with the brother-in-law, they just go off and marry someone else, have a second husband outside the family. According to Beis Shammai, they're not supposed to do that without first having Chalitza with the brother-in-law. Therefore, the child of her second marriage with some outsider has flawed lineage. It's not a mamzer, but it has flawed lineage and cannot serve as a priest in the temple. So if we act in accordance with the statement of Beis Hillel and grant full exemption to the co-wives, the offspring will be a flawed lineage according to the opinion of Beis Shammai, as he is the child of a woman prohibited in marriage by a regular prohibition. Now, although he's not a mamzer, his lineage is nevertheless defective. So instead, let us enact a general decree for co-wives. This is what Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri posits as a solution to this problem. Let us enact a general decree for rival wives that they should perform Chalitza and not enter into Yibum. According to Beis Hillel, that Chalitza is meaningless, but nothing is lost. According to Beis Shammai, that Chalitza releases them from any bond with the brother-in-law, and then they're free to go off and behave just as Beis Hillel would have them behave. So this seems to be a great solution. Just make them perform Chalitza, meaningless ceremony according to Hillel, releases them from any problems, so there's no defective lineage in the children according to Beis Shammai. Beautiful solution. If they act in this manner, they will be permitted to marry others, and the problem will be solved according to all opinions. Why didn't they do it? We're on 15a now. They were unable to finalize the matter according to the proposition raised by Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri before times of trouble arrived. And due to the outbreak of war, they were unable to gather together to vote and establish an accepted halachic ruling. Presumably what we're talking about, this was the Roman siege of Jerusalem and the destruction of the Second Temple. That is the big thing that happened. That siege lasted a long time. There was a lot bigger problems on the minds of the people than what to do about the occasional case of a co-wife. So sometime later, when they returned, right, nice cut there in the movie. Okay, so there was a huge war. After the war, when they returned to discuss the issue, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel said to the other sages, "What shall we do with those earlier rival wives from now onward? Since in the meantime, some rival wives, some co-wives, had entered into Yibum, according to the opinion of Beis Shammai, if we now issue a collective ruling that co-wives may not enter into Yibum, may only perform Chalitza, then the children of these women who followed the opinion of Beis Shammai, married the brother-in-law and had a child, according to the opinion of Beis Hillel, those children are mamzers, and now that we're going to have one ruling for the whole nation, they're going to end up being mamzers. Therefore, it is better not to establish this law at all." Now, the Gemara analyzes this episode in relation to the question we've been discussing for 3 days. Did Beis Shammai actually follow their own opinions, or did they just have a hypothetical disagreement with Beis Hillel, but in practice they would follow the same law? Granted, if you say that Beis Shammai did act in accordance with their own opinion, well, this is the meaning of what Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel said. What shall we do? Since these co-wives had already entered into Yibum, according to the opinion of Beis Shammai, so obviously they were acting on their own opinion, not just stating it hypothetically. So then it was impossible to change the status of their children retroactively. However, if you say that that Beis Shammai, the people who were in the Beis Shammai camp, did not act in accordance with their opinion, then what is the meaning of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel's statement, what shall we do? They didn't need to do anything. Since it was only a hypothetical ruling, there are no actual cases where these children, would be declared mamzers according to a now general principle for everybody, where all, co-wives who have a wife, that their co-wife is exempt, that they have to perform chalitza, even though according to Beis Hillel it wouldn't be necessary, but at least according to Beis Shammai they would be released, even according to the Beis Shammai opinion. So what, right? But if Beis Shammai weren't acting according to their opinion, there are no people in that situation. If Beis Shammai did not act upon their own opinion, they never actually permitted a Yavam to take a rival wife in Yibum. So what are we talking about? So Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak said, well, actually this amendment was necessary, not for the benefit of the children of rival wives, so that they should not be declared mamzers, as Beis Shammai never in fact acted on their ruling, so there were no such children. Rather, it was necessary only for the co-wife herself. If these co-wives married others, in the opinion of Beis Shammai, their marriages were flawed, right? This is the problem with if you follow Beis Hillel, but according to Beis Shammai, they had an obligation to the brother-in-law that they didn't break with chalitza, so then they go marry some other guy, and the children have a defective lineage and cannot become priests. So this ruling of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel would end that situation. So if these rival wives were married others, in the opinion of Beis Shammai, their marriages were flawed as they did not perform chalitza. And as for the question, what shall we do? This is what Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel is saying. With regard to those co-wives who were entirely exempt according to Beis Hillel, what should we do with them according to Beis Shammai, as these co-wives had already married others without performing chalitza? They already did it. They needed to perform chalitza before they married someone else. What shall we do now that they've already done it? The Gemara elaborates. If you say, well, let them perform chalitza now. Okay, they didn't perform the chalitza before they want to marry the outsider, but let them do it now. But if you do this, then they will become repulsive to their husbands, as it will seem to the husband that the woman he has been living with for some time suddenly requires a permit for that marriage. And if you would say, well, let them be repulsive to their husbands. Are their husbands really going to be repulsed by their wife because a ruling comes down that they have to perform this ceremony that they didn't have to perform in the past? If such a husband is going to be repulsed by his wife for that reason, we're not going to be concerned about it because it's so unlikely. But this is not the case. As the Torah says, Proverbs 3:17, her ways are ways of pleasantness, and all her paths are peace. There should not be a Torah ruling that creates dissension between husbands and wives. Rather, bringing Torah into a home should only create peace and pleasantness. So the Gemara suggests further, come in here another source. As Rabbi Tarfon said, we're still examining these cases that came up in this dispute to try and understand, did Beis Shammai actually act on their own opinions or not? So come in here another source. As Rabbi Tarfon said, I yearn for the following scenario. When shall my daughter's rival wife come before me and I will marry her? In other words, in this hypothetical case, I would act in accordance with the opinion of Beis Shammai and take her in Yibum. And this statement indicates that those who held by the traditions of Beis Shammai did indeed act upon their opinion. And the Gemara amends this statement. Rather say, and I will marry her off. Not, I will marry her in Yibum, but rather, I shall act in accordance with the opinion of Beis Hillel and marry her off to others. And the Gemara objects, but he said, I yearn. Meaning, I yearn for a situation where I can act according to my principle, which is the principle of Beis Shammai. So I can prove that I hold by it and I would act on it. He said, I yearn. And if he meant that he would follow the ruling of Beis Hillel, which is the common practice, so then what is the novelty of Rabbi Tarfon's statement? That's just what's done. He doesn't yearn for such a situation. The Gemara responds, Rabbi Tarfon comes to exclude the statement of Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, who maintains that all co-wives perform chalitza. Rabbi Tarfon yearned for an opportunity to demonstrate that the law is not in accordance with the Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. And so the Gemara suggests, we'll come in here about a different incident involving Rabban Gamliel's daughter, who was married to Abba, his brother. Okay, so this is the kind of situation we've been talking about. We really don't find this in modern times, but back then, right, a man's daughter might marry his brother, right, because she can marry her uncle. That's permitted in the Torah. So it happened. Rabban Gamliel's daughter married his brother Abba. And then Abba died childless. So what does that mean? Who needs to perform Yibum? The dead man's brother. But the dead man's brother is the father of the widow. Obviously, he's not going to marry his own daughter. However, Abba had two wives. So, according to Beis Shammai, the co-wife of Rabban Gamliel's daughter performs Yibum or Chalitza with Rabban Gamliel. According to Beis Hillel, because Rabban Gamliel's daughter is exempt from Yibum and therefore Chalitza also, her co-wife is also exempt. So what's Rabban Gamliel going to do? Rabban Gamliel entered into Yibum with her rival wife. Now that sounds like he must be following Beis Shammai. Well, this is apparently conclusive proof that the rival wife of a daughter may enter into Yibum, according to Beis Shammai. The Gemara asks, and how can you understand it that way? Was Rabban Gamliel among the disciples of Beis Shammai? In fact, Rabban Gamliel was a direct descendant of Hillel himself. 100% he was part of Beis Hillel. Beis Hillel say the co-wife is exempt because the wife had, one of the wives has a relationship that prevents Yibum. The co-wife also is exempt from Yibum. So what happened? Rather, but Rabban Gamliel did marry his daughter's co-wife. So how did that happen? The case of Rabban Gamliel's daughter is different, as she was a sexually underdeveloped woman. His daughter was an Elonis. And therefore, the prohibition against marrying her co-wife did not apply, because that Elonis status of his daughter, she was sterile, incapable of having children, and depending on when the husband found out about that, it would render that marriage null and void retroactively. So it's as if there was no marriage to Rabban Gamliel's daughter, and now he simply steps in as Abba's brother and performs Yibum with the widow, who's not related to him in any other way. Others say that Rabban Gamliel's daughter was an Elonis, and it can be, she was an Elonis, and therefore the prohibition against marrying her co-wife does not apply, as explicitly stated in the first Mishnah, Mishnah number 1. And the Gemara asks, but from the fact that it is taught in the latter clause of the same Baraisa, others say that Rabban Gamliel's daughter was an Elonis, it can be derived by inference that the first Tana who's speaking in our Baraisa did not think that Rabban Gamliel's daughter was an Elonis, and rather that Rabban Gamliel was somehow acting according to the teaching of Beis Shammai, which is so weird because he's a direct descendant of Hillel. And the Gemara answers, the dispute between the Tanaim was not about whether or not she was an Elonis, as she certainly was. Rather, the practical difference between them is whether he knew that she was an Elonis at the time of marriage and decided to marry her regardless, right? That Abba, Rabban Gamliel's brother, whether or not he knew that she was an Elonis when he married her. Some maintain in general that if the husband was aware of her condition prior to marriage, then her rival wife is forbidden because he married her anyway. But if he did not know that when he married her and later found out that she was sterile, that would be grounds to annul the marriage, and then the co-wife would be permitted to the brother-in-law. And if you wish, say that the practical difference between them concerns a different case, that of one who married and ultimately divorced. And this is referring to an issue discussed above of whether a woman is considered the co-wife of a forbidden relation simply by virtue of her marriage to the specific man, or whether she must be married to him at the time when the mitzvah of Yibum takes effect. In other words, it might be that Rabban Gamliel's daughter married his brother, and his brother also had a co-wife, But then Rabban Gamliel's daughter Abba divorced Rabban Gamliel's daughter before he died. So at the time that he died, he only had one wife that had no familial relation to Rabban Gamliel, and that's why he was certainly obligated to take her in Yibum or perform chalitza with her. And the fact that Abba had been married to Rabban Gamliel's daughter earlier in time made no difference. They were co-wives at one time, but at the time that Abba died, and with no children, he only had one wife, and so the fact that she had a co-wife who was a prohibited relation to Rabban Gamliel was irrelevant. Rav Misharshia raised an objection against those who claim that Beis Shammai did not act in accordance with their opinion. It seems like we've heard a bunch of situations where Beis Shammai did act according to their opinion. They must have acted according to their opinion, or these teachings don't make sense. But the Gemara is not satisfied, right? So here, Rav Misharshia is proving once again that Beis Shammai did act according to their opinion. It was not just hypothetical. It is taught in a Mishnah, there was an incident involving Rabbi Akiva, who collected an esrog, on the first of the month of Shvat in the spring, and he performed with it 2/10, meaning he tithed this esrog twice. In other words, he separated 2 tithes from the fruit as though it belonged to 2 different tithing years. He removed both the second tithe and the poor man's tithe at the same time. Right, so one who tithes produce in the land of Israel when the temple is standing, first 2% goes to the priest. That's Teruma Gedola. Next 10% goes to the Levite. Then the next 10% in 4 of the 7 years of the Shemitah cycle, the 7-year agricultural cycle. In 4 of those 7 years, you give it to you use it for yourself, second tithe, so that you have what to eat and enjoy when you go on a pilgrimage festival to Jerusalem. In 2 of the 7 years, the 3rd and 6th year, you give the second tithe to the poor, right? So it's like a welfare system, and that can really add up. And so there's plenty for the poor. So what he did is he removed both a second tithe and a poor man's tithe. Now, those never occur in the same year. So what they're saying is Rabbi Akiva, because he harvested this fruit in Shvat, right? And why did he take out as if it was from the previous year when it was second tithe for himself, and like in the current year or the new year, when the new year for the trees is in the springtime in Shvat, when it turns into the 3rd year of the cycle or the 6th, and it's poor man's tithe. Why did he do both? So in other words, he separated 2 tithes from the fruit as though it belonged to 2 different tithing years. He removed both the second tithe and the poor man's tithe at the same time, 2 tithes that should not be separated in the same year. Why? The Mishnah explains, 1 tithe he removed in accordance with the statement of Beis Shammai, who hold that the new year for trees occurs on the 1st of the month of Shvat, which means that the esrog required tithing according to the regulations of the new year. And 1 tithe was in accordance with the statement of Beis Hillel, who hold that the new year for trees is Tu B'Shvat, meaning the 15th of Shvat. And therefore, the esrog required tithing in accordance with the previous year. And the Gemara infers, conclude from here, that Beis Shammai did act in accordance with their opinion, as Rabbi Akiva took care to act in accordance with the ruling of Beis Shammai, just in case it was still, it was already the new year, and he acted according to Beis Hillel in case it was the old year. In other words, if he took care to act according to Beis Shammai, it must be that people followed the opinions of Beis Shammai, didn't just talk about them. The Gemara answers, Rabbi Akiva was uncertain as to his own tradition. He was only following Beis Hillel, and he did not know if Beis Hillel had said that the new year for trees occurs on the 1st of Shvat, or if they said it on the 15th of Shvat. He did not act in accordance with the opinion of Beis Shammai at all. Rather, he sought to act in accordance with the ruling of Beis Hillel, but he was simply uncertain what the opinion of Beis Hillel was, and so he covered his bases. But we don't have any proof from that Beis Shammai acted according to their own opinion. Mar Zutra raised an objection to this issue from a different source. There was an incident in which the daughter-in-law of Shammai the elder, the original Shammai, gave birth to a son. In Shammai's opinion, this newborn baby is immediately obligated in the mitzvah to sit in a sukkah. And he therefore moved the mortar, ma'aziva, covering the ceiling, and he placed sukkah covering, schach, over the bed of the minor so that it could fulfill the mitzvah of dwelling in the sukkah. Conclude from here that if Shammai did this, his followers did likewise, and they acted in accordance with their opinions. The Gemara answers, this is no proof, as anyone watching would say that he did it merely to increase the airflow to the baby, since people would not necessarily think that he removed that part of the ceiling as a ruling of law. This behavior is not considered the formation of a faction among the Jewish people. Mar Zutra raised a different objection. There was an incident involving the Yehu water trough in Jerusalem. This water trough, which ran through Jerusalem, which had a hole that connected it to a mikveh, and all the ritual purifications in Jerusalem were performed in it, i.e. people immersed their utensils in this trough. It was a kelim mikveh. Right? There's two kinds of mikvahs. There's mikvahs for people, and there's mikvahs for utensils. The mikvah for people, usually very beautiful, like going to the spa, nice spa-like experience. The mikvah for utensils, it's like out in the parking lot, out back, near the dumpster. The water in it is clean, but there's no need to make it a spa-like experience. You just bring your new pots and pans and immerse them once so that they can be brought into a Jewish home. Now, it does have to connect to the mikveh. There has to be running water that satisfies the requirements of a mikveh. So this trough that had water in it that everyone brought their utensils to immerse in Jerusalem, it was connected to a proper mikveh, a people mikveh. Right, so it had a hole, and it had a hole that connected it to the mikveh, and all the ritual purifications were performed in it. And Beis Shammai sent messengers, and they widened the opening in the trough. As in the opinion of Beis Shammai, the hole was not large enough for the trough to be connected to the adjacent mikveh. As Beis Shammai say, the two areas are not connected unless the majority of it is opened. In other words, they require the major portion of the barrier between the mikveh and the nearby trough to be open in order for the trough to be considered part of the mikveh and the immersions of utensils in it qualified, proper, legit. According to Beis Hillel, you only need a small hole. And we learned in a Mishna, Beis Hillel hold that a joining of mikvahs is effective if the hole between them has the width of the tube used to pour water in and out of a wineskin. And its open space there is enough room for about 2 fingers that can return to their place. In other words, if it is possible to insert into the hole 2 fingers that can move around on all sides, then the hole is sufficiently large to be considered a connection. According to Beis Shammai, however, the hole must open up the majority of the barrier between the 2 areas. So if so, conclude from this that Beis Shammai did act in accordance with their opinions. And the Gemara rejects this contention. Now we're on 15b. There, anyone who was watching this would say that the people who happened to come, they might be from Beis Shammai, but they weren't trying to make a halachic ruling. They were just saying there needs to be more water in the trough, so we're making the opening bigger so there's more water there. We don't know for sure that they were objecting to the legal ramifications of the hole that was there according to Beis Hillel and saying it needs to be bigger according to Beis Shammai. So it's no proof. So the Gemara cites another relevant source. Maybe this one will prove that Beis Shammai did follow their own opinions, even though they were different from Beis Hillel. Coming here, as Rabbi Elazar Bar Tzadok said, when I studied Torah with Rabbi Yochanan the Harani, who was a disciple of Beis Shammai, I saw that he would eat dry bread in salt in years of drought. I went and informed my father of his meager meal. This poor man, right? When the nation is in drought, this guy's only eating bread and salt. That's all he eats the whole year. And he said to me, my father said to me, take olives for him. And so I took for him some olives so he would have a little bit better food. Rabbi Yochanan the Harani saw that these olives that I brought him were moist with the liquid that oozes out of olives. And that liquid, so we've learned before that food, in order to become tameh, ritually impure, it must first come into contact with one of the 7 liquids that make food susceptible to tuma. Now, the fact that food becomes moist with water or oil or dew or milk or any one of these 7 liquids doesn't make the food impure, but it makes it susceptible to impurity. So some people who are like the chaverim, right, where they can't be sure, like if the food is dry, then even if it came into contact with tuma, with ritual impurity, it's still tahor, ritually pure, because it's not susceptible to impurity until it becomes moist. But if they're going to be super machmir, super stringent and careful with themselves, then they're not going to eat food that they don't know where, hasn't been watched carefully from beginning to end, if it's moist, because it's susceptible to impurity. So when Elazar ben Tzadok went to Yochanan the Harani, who was so stringent, and said, come on, you're eating, like, you need a better diet. Here, have some olives. So Yochanan the Harani looked at those olives and that they were moist and thought to himself, well, I can't be sure that they're not impure, so I'm just not going to eat them. He said to me, I do not eat olives. He didn't say, I can't eat them because they're moist and they might be impure. It's one sage talking to another, and he's like sort of distrusting the kashrus, the kosher certification, as it were, of the sage who's bringing him these olives. So instead of saying, I'm a little unsure, I don't want to eat it because it might be impure, he just said, I don't like olives. I don't eat olives. He spoke politely, and he stated that he did not eat olives because he did not wish to embarrass his benefactor by disclosing that he feared that they might have become ritually impure. So Rabbi Elazar bar Tzadok continued his story. I went and informed my father of what had happened. My father said to me, go and say to him that the barrel containing the olives was perforated, but it was clogged by sediments in the oil, and therefore some moisture remained inside. However, due to the presence of the hole, the olives were not rendered susceptible to ritual impurity. And this was a ruling, and we learned this in a Mishna with regard to a barrel of preserved olives. Beis Shammai say it does not need to be perforated, as the juice issuing from the olives does not render them susceptible to ritual impurity. But Beis Hillel say that it does need to be perforated, as they maintain that the juice of olives is considered oil, which is one of the liquids that render food susceptible to impurity, and it therefore renders the olives susceptible to ritual impurity. But Beis Hillel concede that if the barrel was perforated so that that juice could run out of the barrel, and subsequently that the hole at the bottom was clogged by sediments, so some moisture remained in the barrel, so then it is ritually pure despite the moisture of the olives. Since liquids render food susceptible to ritual impurity only if they were placed on them intentionally. The hole in the barrel clearly shows that one did not intend for the juice to be there. By boring a hole in the barrel, he has rendered it obvious that he did not desire the presence of the olive juices, and therefore it does not matter that the hole becomes blocked and some moisture remains in the barrel. Therefore, this is going to satisfy Yochanan the Harani's objection, and now he'll eat the olives. The Baraisa adds, and although Rabbi Yochanan the Harani was a disciple of Shammai, right, Shammai says you don't need to perforate the barrel. So if he's a follower of Beis Shammai, he should just eat the olives. Why does he have a concern? And although Rabbi Yochanan the Harani was a disciple of Shammai, he always acted only in accordance with the statements of Beis Hillel. And the Gemara infers, granted, if you say that Beis Shammai acted in accordance with their own opinions, well, this is Rabbi Yochanan the Harani's greatness, i.e. he is praised for acting in accordance with the opinion of Beis Hillel, even though all the other followers of Beis Shammai would follow their own opinions. However, if you say that Beis Shammai did not act in accordance with their own rulings, so then what is the greatness and the uniqueness of Rabbi Yochanan the Harani? From here it can be inferred that Beis Shammai generally did act in accordance with their own opinions. And the Gemara adds, come and hear a different proof that the followers, that Beis Shammai acted in accordance with their own opinions. They asked Rabbi Yehoshua, what is the law with regard to the co-wife of a daughter? And he said to them, it is a matter of dispute between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, as we've been discussing. They continued to ask him, okay, it's a dispute between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, and in accordance with whose statement of law is the law? And he said to them, why are you inserting my head between two great mountains? I.e., between the two great disputing opinions, between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. I fear lest these two mountains break my skull. Don't ask me to give a ruling. We know that there's a general dispute on this issue. Don't ask me who the law follows. Ask somebody that's above my pay grade. However, he gave this answer. I shall testify to you about two great families that were in Jerusalem. The Beis Tsevoim family, who came from the town of Ben Achmai, and the Beis Kophai family from the town of Ben Mekoshesh. And they were the descendants of rival wives who married others in accordance with the opinion of Beis Hillel. Right? So there were two situations, there were two families where some generations back, there was a woman who came up for Yibum with the brother-in-law, but she had a co-wife who had some kind of familial relationship with that brother-in-law. So the co-wife was exempt, and the wife in question followed the ruling of Beis Hillel. She's exempt, no Yibum, no Chalitza, went off and married a priest. Right? Went a different person, and she married a priest. And they were the descendants of rival wives who married others in accordance with the opinion of Beis Hillel. And from them, both these families, came not only priests, but high priests, Kohen Gadols, who served on the altar. Accordingly, I can testify that this was the accepted halachic practice throughout the generations. Right? Beis Shammai, we're not sure what they did according to their own opinions, but the law is according to Beis Hillel. And women who didn't perform chalitza because they had a co-wife that exempted them could go off without that chalitza, marry a priest, and the children of that union serves as a priest and could even become high priest. The Gemara infers from this statement, granted, if you say that Beis Shammai acted in accordance with their opinions, this is why Rabbi Yehoshua said, I fear that these two mountains will crack my skull, since a conclusive halachic ruling would mean that certain children who followed Beis Shammai's ruling would be considered mamzers according to Beis Hillel, and the descendants of that family might take vengeance upon him. However, if you say that that Beis Shammai did not act in accordance with their opinions, then why did Rabbi Yehoshua say, I fear? Why did he have to fear? If everyone's following the law according to Beis Hillel, who's going to be mad if he says the law is according to Beis Hillel? And the Gemara answers, and even if Beis Shammai did act in accordance with their rulings, what is the reason that he said, I fear? Didn't Rabbi Yehoshua say that in his opinion, a mamzer is only someone born from a union of those liable to receive court-imposed capital punishment, a court-imposed, an earthly death penalty, not charis, death at the hands of the heavenly court, right? The court-imposed death penalty that a Beis Din, the rabbinic court imposes, that's a stiffer penalty than that you will be cut off according to a heavenly judgment. Where am I? So according to Rabbi Yehoshua, the only person who's considered a mamzer is somebody whose parents violated, such a prohibition that if two people did that and they were warned not to do that, an earthly court would condemn them to death and carry out a death penalty. If so, in the opinion of Rabbi Yehoshua, the children of rival wives who entered into Yibum would not be mamzers at all, and therefore he had no reason to fear reprisals because, according to him, you're only a mamzer if your parents violate a death penalty offense. Marrying, your Yibum, which is prohibited according to Hillel because it's a co-wife of a prohibited relation, is a charis-bearing penalty, but not a court-imposed death penalty. And the Gemara answers, even if this is the case, nevertheless, he did have something to fear, as although the child of a rival wife would not be a mamzer, he would nevertheless be a flawed lineage and disqualified from serving in the temple as a priest. The Gemara adds that this can be derived from a kal v'chomer inference, also known in Latin as an a fortiori inference, from the case of a widow. Just as in the case of a widow whose prohibition does not apply at all, as she is forbidden in marriage, does not apply to all, as she is forbidden in marriage only to the high priest, right? The high priest, all priests cannot marry divorcees, but a regular priest can marry a widow. The Kohen Gadol cannot marry a widow. So a widow is prohibited only to one person, to the high priest. She's permitted to everybody else. And yet, the lineage of her son is flawed. If she does marry the high priest, then the child of that union cannot become a priest, cannot serve in the temple at all. As he is disqualified from the priesthood, the son of this co-wife would certainly be disqualified from the priesthood, as her prohibition applies equally to all, even regular Israelites. Incidentally, the Gemara notes a problem with the above discussion. They asked Rabbi Yehoshua about co-wives, and he answered them about the children of co-wives. He did not refer to the co-wives themselves. And the Gemara explains, they asked him questions on two matters. First, what is the law with regard to co-wives? And if you say that the law in the case of co-wives is in accordance with the opinion of Beis Hillel, that they are exempt, what is the law according to Beis Shammai in the case of children of co-wives who, following Beis Hillel, married others without performing chalitza? Then what is the result for Beis Shammai? It should be that these women violated a prohibition that is not even charis bearing, so they're disqualified from the priesthood, but in all other respects, they're fine. And the Gemara asks, what difference does this question make? Since Rabbi Yehoshua maintains that the law is in accordance with the ruling of Beis Hillel, why even talk about Beis Shammai's opinion on this matter? And the Gemara explains, his answer enables one to resolve a different issue. The case of a child of one who remarries his divorcee according to the opinion of Beis Hillel. Is the child of a divorcee who remarried her previous husband after she had been married to another man fit or disqualified from the priesthood? And the Gemara explains, do we say, following a kal v'chomer inference, and just as with a widow married to a high priest whose prohibition does not apply to everybody as she is prohibited in marriage only to the high priest, and yet the lineage of her son is flawed as he is disqualified from the priesthood, so too in the case of this co-wife whose prohibition applies equally to all men because she didn't perform chalitza, is it not right that her son should be a flawed lineage according to Beis Shammai? Or perhaps, and I'm almost done, or perhaps this comparison can be refuted. What about the fact that a widow is different, as she herself is disqualified from marrying a priest, i.e. if a high priest has intercourse with her, she is disqualified from marrying any member of the entire priesthood, including common priests, whereas a remarried divorcee herself is not disqualified from marrying into the priesthood. And Rabbi Yehoshua said to them, I fear that if I issue a decisive ruling concerning co-wives, this might lead to a conflict, whereas with regard to the children of co-wives, I testify to you that they are not disqualified since, as I stated, their descendants served as high priests. You don't have to take my word for it, it happened. Okay, that brings us to the end of page 15. We pick it up right at the top of 16a tomorrow with God's help. And we have just a couple minutes left for questions. On Yevamos 15. Sharon, I know that when I worked in a traditional community, I could not even meet professionally alone in my boss's office without the door being open, even though I was the same age as his mother. How could it be that it is possible that a wife and her ex be in the same room in and assume nothing went on? I think you're right. I think there's probably more to that case than I was spelling out. I think the importance of it is what is the assumption? Do we assume that they might have had sex and they're liable to bring a sin offering, or they might have had sex and now they're married And before they would be free to go, be with other people, he has to give her another get, right? There has to be another official divorce ritual or not. Let me see if there was a note on that. Yeah, I'm not sure. It's not explained in the notes, so I'm not sure. But the point is that they had different outcome according to the law of Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai. And if Beis Shammai was always acting in accordance with the opinions of Beis Hillel to avoid conflict, then it wouldn't have mattered. I think that was the point there. And it seems like we saw proof after proof after proof that Beis Shammai did act in accordance with their own opinions, except where or in a way that would lead to strife among within the nation. And that's why even though they would follow their own opinions, at least in certain circumstances, if that led to a problem with a family that followed Beis Hillel, everyone would be on notice of what had happened so that nobody would wake up, the next morning and go, what have I done? Something terrible has happened. Okay, that's what I've got for us today. And with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow for page 16 here in Tractate Yevamos. You guys are doing great. Have a